Hey guys, just give me a sec. Strong करना coffee please, thank you. Hey guys, sorry for this delay. Let's just start. Cool. So in today's class, we're going to discuss certain current affairs from the month of January. There weren't a lot of important things that happened in the month of December, so therefore we could cover it in about one class easily. So today let's discuss some of the other important things that happened in the month of January. We will also, like, some of it will flow over obviously to the next lecture. So most likely the next lecture would be a little bit of January and a little bit of February, okay? By the way, is there any confirmation regarding your exam? A lot of exams are being postponed. So anyways, I guess Pratikesh and the others will update you with regards to that. So the first topic that we are going to discuss today. Okay, so I got a message that some students have doubts, etc. So just I'll stay after class and then we can discuss any doubts that you have. Okay. So let's talk about the G7. Now we're going to talk about G7 because something very interesting has happened is that the United Kingdom is going to host the G7 summit this time. Now India is usually not usually. I mean, India is not a part of the G7 initiative. However, this time the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, has invited India as a special guest, and he's invited our Prime Minister to attend the summit, which is scheduled in sometimes in June 2021. So as of now, it seems very unlikely that the Prime Minister will actually go in because India is emerging as a COVID hotspot. And it's unlikely that the Prime Minister would be traveling to England and the European Union subsequently. So most likely, whenever this happens around the time of stated time of exam, most likely it'll be a virtual summit. Okay. So more details will flow in vis-a-vis what actually happens in the G7 summit, if and when it happens or whenever it happens online. But let's just discuss what exactly the G7 is, whether the G7 is also actually relevant, should our Prime Minister be focusing on attending the G7 or not. Okay. Cool. So interestingly, apart from India, Australia and South Korea have also been invited to participate as guest countries. Okay, these are also not a part of the G7 countries. Okay, now it's not that India has been invited for the first time in the 2019 summit, which was conducted in Biarritz in France, when France was the chairperson or the holder of the G7 summit. India was invited as a special guest there as well. Okay, so let's try to understand what exactly is the G7. So G7 is basically an informal grouping, right? It doesn't have like a secretariat, etc. So it's effectively a bloc, like a group of countries or a clique of countries. Now the idea is that all of these countries are effectively industrialized democracies. Okay, so you have countries like Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, and the United States. Now Russia was also a part of the G7 right from 1998 to 2014. However, in 2014, Russia decided to annex Crimea, okay, and then attacked Ukraine, and it basically took like a large portion of Ukraine, as in it captured from Ukraine on the grounds that there were a lot of Russian-speaking population there, and they felt that they had a closer obligation with Russia, and Russia believed that they would face persecution by majority of the people in Ukraine. I mean, that's at least the ground that Russia used. And as of today, Russia effectively has control over the Crimean region. Okay, so this was known as the Crimean crisis back in 2014. Now, because of this aggression that was showed by China against Ukraine, these countries started boycotting China. Sorry, not China, Russia. These countries started boycotting Russia, and Russia was kicked out of the G7 initiative. So earlier on, this was the G8 or the group of eight, and after Russia's exit, now it is called the G7. Okay. Now, as I said, like, it's an informal group as such, so they don't have a charter or a secretariat or anything. So obviously, there is no formal criteria as such with regards to who can be a member of the G7 or not. Okay. But the general consensus is that the members of the G7 are effectively your developed democracies. So democracy is something very important. It's industrialized democracy, right? Otherwise, China would have also been a part of this, because China is also very, very industrialized. It's just that China, since China is not a democracy, it seems like that is one of the criteria for being a part of the G7 or G8. Okay. Now, G7 meets annually. Okay, and these are presided over by leaders of one of the countries on a rotational basis, and they discuss broad issues like global economic governance, international security, and energy policy. So, global economic governance would be, for example, if you've been following the news, the president of the US has said that there should be a global tax on all corporations, so that a lot of these countries that act as tax havens and they allow companies to set up offices there, they help these countries to evade tax. And a lot of these companies do actually end up setting up offices there, and they pay very low taxes. So the idea is that the company shouldn't evade taxation just because one or two rogue countries decide to not tax countries which incorporate their offices in those geographical locations, right? So things like that would be discussed. Then you have international security issues. For example, let's say, should US pull out of the Afghanistan? When US will pull out of Afghanistan, what exactly will happen? Will the NATO allies also, let's say, pull out of Afghanistan? Is there an emerging, what that they will discuss about, let's say, probably the crisis in Syria, or let's say they would discuss about freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. So all of these things which pertain to international security and energy policy. For example, how soon or how late should we shift from non-renewable sources of energy to renewable sources of energy? How much money will it take to shift from all these renewable sources to non-renewable sources? Do we have that much money? Is this shift feasible or not, right? So all of these things are generally discussed in the G7 summit. Now, there is nothing formal here. This is basically like a ground for all of these leaders to meet. So there is no let's say, there's no sort of an agreement, etc., that comes out of these meetings, right? It's completely informal. Leaders just get together, they discuss certain things, and then they go back. So it's like a meeting ground. Okay. Now, if you look at why G7 is important, it's because currently, in its current form, if you take all of these 7 countries, it it makes about 30% of the world. Now, about 30 years ago, this used to be 30% of the global economy. I mean, now earlier on, it used to be 70% of the global economy, but now you have economic giants like India, Brazil, Mexico, China, and Russia also now, which is not a part of this. So therefore, its importance has slightly shrunk. So earlier on, 30 years ago, it was basically 70% of the global economy, right? So obviously, anything that was discussed here was taken with a lot of heft. So right now, also they have a significant influence in the sense that it all still makes about 30% of the global economy. However, it's a much lesser figure than the earlier monopoly of 70% that they enjoyed about 30, 35 years ago. Now, as I mentioned earlier, India is not a member of the G7. That's the reason why it's being invited as a special guest. So let's see why India should attend your G7 summit and what are the benefits that India can get. Now, first, very usual answer, it's just another international platform. Therefore, if India is on good relations with all these G7 countries, then India can further its own national security or foreign policy interest, especially things like granting India membership to the nuclear club, putting through or voting for United Nations Security Council reform, whereby India and certain other countries can then be made permanent members. So things like that could be discussed in this forum. Then effectively, if you look at the sort of countries that exist in this forum as of date, and the other countries that have been invited along with India, that is South Korea and Australia, these countries have also had their own tussles with China, right? So we've had a border dispute. These countries also have their trade disputes, etc. And they're also effectively fed up of China, right? So the current G7 plus these countries, which is a group of 10 countries, and they've already kicked out Russia, which is the only ally of China effectively right now in the developed world, right? So the new version of the G7, if it includes your India, South Korea, and Australia as well, now its economic heft increases in the sense that it then will constitute about 50% of the global GDP. And subsequently, it will also challenge China, right? Because realistically speaking, there is no other way that you can challenge China. The only way that you can effectively challenge a huge country like China is economically. And in the economic sphere also, China is a colossal giant. It's not going to be easy. Like countries will have to collude, countries will have to cooperate. So this sort of an opportunity could very well be provided by the G7 summit, and India could maybe use this opportunity. Now, again, it will also help India economically, because the thing is, as Indian population increases, the only solution that we have to give employment and to increase our GDP is that India has to become a manufacturing hub. So one of the beautiful things that have happened outside of the after the COVID pandemic is that globally people want to rely. I mean, people want to dilute their reliance on China as a manufacturer, right? So they want to diversify their manufacturing activities. So India could potentially use this forum to attract a lot of FDI or other such investments, and then it can be used for India to like script its new growth story after the COVID-19 pandemic. Right? So this is something that India could gain by our Prime Minister attending the G7 meeting. However, the most important question is it enough? Like, does the Prime Minister really need to go? Because is the G7 even relevant anymore? Okay. So just like you have G7, there is another informal grouping known as the G20. And over the last decade or so, it's been seen that G20 is now effectively as an alternate forum to G7, right? Because the thing is, G7 is very exclusive. It doesn't have members from Asia. It doesn't have members from Africa. It doesn't have members from Eastern Europe. It doesn't have members from West Asia or Middle East, right? So therefore, it's a very exclusive club, and all of these are countries with aging populations, and the global growth story for the 21st century is not going to be scripted in any of these countries. You have to have countries like your Brazil, China, and India, and these are not a part of the G7 initiative, right? So it's likely that G7 is not relevant. Now, G7 told Russia that, okay, Crimea happened a long time ago. Let's take you back into the G7 itself. Russia said, sorry, I really don't think that G7 has a future. And Russia said, I am anyways a part of the G20. And Russia believes, and most countries across the world believe, that G20 is a better forum, right? Now, India already is a part of G20. And the primary agenda of G20 is to fight against the global dominance of the G7 countries in the economic sphere, right? So therefore, there could be conflicting interests that India has. So G7 would obviously want to retain its own monopoly over the sort of economic superstructure that persists. And G20 countries are trying to fight against this specific and this very menace of total economic domination by the G7 countries. So therefore, G7 and G20 can be at loggerheads, and this is something that India has to tread very carefully with. Good. So this is pretty much it that I had to discuss with regards to G7. Later on in June, whenever this summit happens, if your exam gets postponed, then this will become important from your point of view of your exam. Then we'll discuss what exactly and what are the things that were discussed in the G7 forum. Until then, this should be enough for you. Okay. Now, moving on from international relations, I have two topics to discuss with you vis-a-vis economics. The first one is about regulating NBFCs. Now, there have been a lot of articles about NBFCs that have been in the news of late, because NBFCs have screwed up in the sense that you have DHFL, you have ILNFS, etc. You have a lot of those crises, and the RBI since SEBI and RBI since then have been trying to regulate NBFCs. Now, another thing that I want to discuss in economics is startups, right? Because startups seem to be the new buzzword, and India has been seeing a lot of new unicorn startups. So let's try to understand what sort of a startup ecosystem exists in India, which ministry, which department is responsible for creating a diverse and a, let's say, enabling startup ecosystem, right? So these are two things that we will discuss about in economics today. Good. So let's discuss the regulation of NBFCs first. Cool. So RBI has recently said that NBFCs are becoming very, very important. There are certain small NBFCs that we don't need to regulate that much. But now there are certain NBFCs that have become very big. Sometimes they have become too big to fail, in the sense that if they fail, then the impact on the economic system would be such that it would be devastating. So the government will have to step in at some point of time to regulate these NBFCs and prevent them from going bankrupt. And in the eventuality that they go bankrupt, then the government has to step in to bail out the NBFCs, because the wider economic repercussions to the entire system would be too much otherwise. Okay. So before we try to understand what sort of regulations RBI is talking about, let's try to understand what an NBFC is. Okay. Now, so your CLAT syllabus basically says that you don't really need to have a lot of legal knowledge. If any legal knowledge is required by you to answer a question, that legal knowledge is going to be provided to you in that paragraph that you're reading, right? So I'm not going to go very specifically and very technically into the legal definition of an NBFC. So basically, NBFC is a company that is registered under the Companies Act, and it is engaged in the business of loans and advances. In the sense, it gives out loans, it acquires shares, bonds, etc. All these, it deals in financial instruments, etc. Okay. Now, NBFC cannot be any institution whose primary business is any sort of industrial activity, agricultural activity, sale on good purchase, okay, or providing any sort of construction of immovable property, etc. So NBFC is effectively a company that is going to either deal in deposits or money, accepting money from people, or it's going to deal in financial products, majorly, right? It can obviously have some ancillary, let's say, obviously it can construct its own office, for example. It can probably do a little bit of your purchase or sale of normal goods, but that can't be its primary business. So primary business has to be the seller, or it has to deal primarily in financial products. Okay. Now, NBFCs, to begin with, they are given a license by the RBI. Now, once the RBI gives a license, after that, the NBFCs are regulated by their separate bodies, right? So let's say there is an NBFC which deals in the securities market. So RBI will give it a license, but after that, it's going to be governed by the SEBI, or the Securities and Exchange Board of India. So the licensing is given by RBI. After the licensing has been done, the regulation is carried out by the specific bodies that have been created. This is a point that you should remember. If they ask about NBFCs, this is a trick question that they'll ask. The licensing is only given by RBI. No other regulatory body can give an NBFC license. Now, once that license is given, then RBI doesn't have a major role to play. The majority of the regulation is done by the specific body that exists for regulation of NBFCs in that sector. Okay. Now, let's see how our NBFCs are categorized. So let's say in terms of liabilities, they are categorized into deposit and non-deposit accepting NBFCs. Basically, if an NBFC can accept deposits, which means that if an NBFC can take money or accept money from public, then it is a deposit taking NBFC. If it cannot take deposits or money or any sort of deposits from the public, then it's a non-deposit taking or non-deposit accepting NBFC. Now, within the non-deposit accepting NBFC also, there are two differentiations based on size. So if you are a very big NBFC, then you are a systematically important non-deposit holding company. Okay. Otherwise, you're a regular non-deposit holding company. Okay. Systematically important companies are those companies which are deemed to be too big to fail. So similarly, you have banks also that are too big to fail. These are DSIBs. Okay. Domestic systematically important banks. You have your ICICI and SBI there. So let's say, so the governance model for these banks is stricter, because let's say if SBI is to fail tomorrow, or if ICICI is to fail tomorrow, it's not that only the SBI or only ICICI will end up failing. They will basically take the entire economic system with them as well. So therefore, these systematically NBFCs or banks are very important, and they have to be regulated much harder than the other banks and NBFCs. Okay. Now, then they're also divided by the sort of activities that they undertake. So let's say there would be an NBFC which gives loans and advances for car loans, etc. There could be an NBFC which deals with agricultural loans, etc. So you have different kind of NBFCs which are categorized based on the sort of roles they play, the sort of job they do. Okay. Now, the benefit of NBFC is that NBFCs play a very important role in the sense that a bank cannot go everywhere, right? A bank cannot have such a huge arsenal of financial products. Banks have very limited financial products, and banks also don't have enough reach. Now, NBFCs will step in and give more innovative financial products to consumer in this. So effectively, it will increase the penetration of the banking sector, and it will not banking sector, the financial sector effectively, and it will give a lot of products to people who have been classified as unbanked. Basically, जिन तक banks और उनके projects नहीं पहुंच पाए हैं because of their small nature and because of the flexibilities that NBFCs have, NBFCs can basically get access to such people and companies and probably give them such financial products that will help them solve a lot of day-to-day problems that these people face. Okay. So NBFCs initially in the last 5-6 years, they've become very important, and this sector has seen a lot of growth. For example, in the last 5 years itself, your balance sheet of NBFCs has doubled from 20 lakh crores to about 49, 50 lakh crores, right? So like this jump is phenomenal. There is a lot of money floating around in the NBFC market. And when this much money is floating around, obviously the RBI will come up and say that, boss, we need more stricter and more stringent regulations. Okay. Now, one of the best things about NBFCs is that NBFCs can lend money to a lot of activities that banks don't support. Okay. Now, the primary, so I say, for example, I'll give you a simple example. The primary way that a bank makes money is that it accepts deposits from people like you and me. We will keep our money in the bank. Now, the bank makes a calculation that, okay, on a given day or in a given month or in a given year, not everyone who has put their money in the banks will come in and demand that money from the bank. So the bank makes certain calculations. There are obviously regulatory guidelines also. You have to maintain a certain amount of money with yourself. So that plus the sort of calculations that the banks make, they keep a certain set of money and then they use the other surplus money and they lend it to other people. So let's say I open an FD in the bank and I get like a 5% interest. The bank will then probably lend that money out to some corporate or some other company or some individual also at a 10% rate. And basically the bank will make use of the arbitrage or the 5% difference between the deposit rate it is giving me and the lending rate it is charging someone. And that is where the banks make money from. Now, the thing is that deposits generally are short term, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So banks will want to give loans for smaller projects, like 2, 3 year projects. But any and every infrastructure project, for example, that is of any importance, let's say you have to construct a dam, let's say you have to construct a highway, let's say you have to construct a nuclear power plant. So any of these large infrastructure projects that you have to construct will obviously require a lot of money, and they will also require money over a long period of time. Now, banks can't give these loans because I, Abhinav Negi, will go to the bank and say, boss, you've had my money for 2 years. Now I need my money back because I need to spend it. So the banks would be stuck, let's say, right? So the banks, let's say the banks give money to make a dam. Now a dam will take 15 years to make. The dam will start making money 20 years down the line. So obviously banks cannot lend money to projects like this. And if banks do end up giving money to projects like these, a lot of these projects then turn into NPAs, and that's a non-performing assets, and that's a separate crisis altogether, right? So here is where the NBFCs can step in. So NBFCs can create financially innovative products. Let's say अब हम लोग गरीब लोग हैं, नॉर्मल 2 लाख 5 लाख 10 लाख दे सकते हैं, not more than that. So NBFCs would probably go to somebody like an Ambani and say, boss, you have so much money, why don't you give me 100 crores and let's talk about returning this 100 crores to you 25 years down the line. So banks can't do that, but NBFCs can make innovative products like that, and NBFCs can target individuals like this, right? So this is a sort of advantage. This is one example that I'm giving as to why NBFCs penetrate where banks cannot, okay, and how NBFCs lend for activities that banks cannot support. Okay, now let's understand why, therefore, is the need for changing the current regulation. So there are certain regulations that exist for NBFCs. Now, obviously, RBI said regulation hai, but हमें और ज़्यादा regulation चाहिए. So let's understand what's the need to change these regulations. Okay. So there is a threat of systemic risk. So as I told you, some NBFCs, they started small, but now these NBFCs have become too big to fail. ये इतने बड़े हो गए that if they fail, there is a risk to the entire economic structure of the country. So there are risks that there have certain NBFCs which are important, like your ILFS and DHFL, and these guys have had problems, and these guys pose a significant systemic risk. So the RBI is saying that, boss, these guys have screwed up in the past. We can't let them do it again. So we'll probably have to regulate them to ensure that these people do not enter into such transactions. So, like, I'm going to give you a small summary vis-a-vis what happened with the ILFS and DHFL. So effectively, the crisis that ILNFS faced was a liquidity crunch. Okay. And that happened because of asset liability mismatch. Now, ILNFS had taken short-term loans. I mean, short-term deposits from people. लोग आए, लोगों ने deposit दिए 4 साल, 5 साल, 6 साल, 2 साल. Now, obviously, after 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, ILNFS has to return that money. So the liabilities that ILNFS had were short-term liabilities, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Now, ILNFS used this money and lent it to large long-term infrastructure projects. So it was creating assets in the sense kahin highway banna tha, kahin dam banna tha, but the repayment would start 10-15 years down the line. So now you had liabilities which were short term, 2, 3 or 4, 5 year liabilities. You had to give money, and your assets in the sense that you had to start receiving payment for the loans. Now these were long drawn out payments, 10-15 years down the line. So it's not that ILNFS was bankrupt, it's just that ILNFS didn't have liquidity at that point of time. So it was a liquidity crunch, and therefore this sort of a crisis is known as an asset liability mismatch. So all your assets are long term, 10-15 year assets, but your liabilities are short term. And when people come to you and say, okay, fulfill the liability that you have, you just don't have the money to fulfill the liabilities. So this is effectively what happened with ILNFS. Now, this is not a scam per se. So ILFS was, you can attribute it to mal governance or bad governance. This is not a scam per se. Okay. Now, another example of an NBFC in the housing sector is the DHFL. So Dewan Housing Finance Limited. So there are allegations that the promoters are actually trying to steal money. And once this news came out, the share started plummeting, and it used to be a very big NBFC, but right now, because the market capitalization is gone, because the share price has no value, these promoters are struggling to even pay a small, like it's not a small debt, but for these large companies, it's struggling to pay a debt of 900 crore rupees. I hope there is no disturbance because it has started raining heavily and I have metal roofs. So if it's bothering you, I'm sorry. I hope it's not a big problem. It should stop in a while. Now, because there is a systemic threat of systemic risks, RBI has said that we need to govern some of the NBFCs. Now, another thing, last month, and not last to last month, then we were discussing current affairs for I think November or December. I talked to you about how RBI's internal working group had met, and they had said that we will expand licensing norms to large NBFCs in the sense that they would allow certain NBFCs to become banks. Now, RBI said that if we are going to anyways allow a lot of these large NBFCs to become banks, NBFCs which have been functioning for 10-15 years and they have certain amount of money with them, we might as well regulate them better so that the transition from an NBFC which is less regulated to a bank which is heavily regulated is smooth. To ensure smoothness in this transaction, as RBI has said that we anyways will allow them to become banks, so might as well start governing them right now itself. Now, the third reason why NBFCs need regulation is that there is a new sector that has emerged, which is called the fintech sector or the financial technology sector. Now, this sector is causing a lot of disruption with regards to how we understand traditional banking and how we understand traditional NBFCs. So, therefore, NBFCs probably could act like a bridge between your banks and fintech companies. And for that to happen, all of these three, the banks, fintech companies, and NBFCs, have to be brought in at the same level, at a level playing field. And that is something that these regulations can help with. Okay. So let's look at the broader changes that the RBI has proposed. So RBI has said that earlier on for NBFCs, they had a light touch approach, which meant they gave licenses and then NBFCs were generally taken as regulated by other entities and RBI didn't interfere too much. Okay. So what RBI has now proposed is that it will create a 4-layer regulatory framework. Okay. So there will be 4 layers of NBFCs: your base layer, middle layer, upper layer, and top layer. So the degree of regulation is proportional to the perception of risk in that sector, right? So let's say the low risk NBFCs. It's raining very hard. Anyway, so am I audible? Like, is there a lot of disturbance, Pratikesh? Give me 1 second. I'll just see what I can do to reduce the noise.
You are audible.
Pratikesh, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. We can hear you. Sir, you have muted yourself.
Hi guys, sorry for going on. I am not able to hear what I'm saying. I hope you are able to hear. One of the problems of working from home. Anyway, so what the RBI is now saying is that what the RBI is now saying is that they will create a four-layer regulatory framework, and this framework will be based on the perception of risk. So let's say there is a low risk NBFC that would be kept in the lower or base layer, and the RBI will not interfere too much in the lower layer. So in the top layer, obviously you will have NBFCs which are high risk. Yeah, I know my voice is not here, but it just started raining and there's a storm right now. So let's try to cooperate. Let's see if you can hear. Let me finish this topic at least, and probably if my voice is not here, we'll take a class later. But ये topic खत्म कर लेते हैं, ठीक है? So RBI says that we will have four layers. और risk के हिसाब से we will decide which NBFC to put in what layer. Now, the RBI has also said that we will change the classification for NPL, right? So as of now, for NBFC, if a loan goes bad and if it's not paid for 180 days, it's only then considered an NPF. It's considered an NPA. Now, because RBI wants to regulate these NPFs, it also wants to regulate how and when they can classify loans as NPAs, because monitoring the number of NPAs and the volume of NPAs that NBFCs have can be a good source of indication of whether an NBFC is going to go bad or not, right? So now they have tightened these regulations and norms, and instead of an NPA being declared, a loan being declared as an NPA after 180 days of non-payment, now this is going to be declared as an NPA after 90 days of non-payment to an NBFC. I know Pushpi, I know my voice is not here. There's a storm going on here. Let's just finish this topic, chota sa hi bach gaya, and then we can probably um, do the other topics later in the next class. Okay? So there's only one slide, and let's try to finish this slide, and probably next topic we can discuss in the next class. So I think it's going to stop. I think there's a thunderstorm, but is my voice clear now? I mean, with the storm, etc., in the mountains,
Yes, sir, it's clear now. Somewhat clear.
I can't hear anything. You'll have to type. Better now, I guess, right? Because the thunderstorm has also stopped a little. Okay, great. Somewhat here. Cool. So probably this will go away in a minute or so. Ashish Gupta says you can take my topic. I don't know what your topic is, dude. Like we'll discuss it, whatever that is. I think you have a doubt, right? You can just message whatever. Anyways, so how will these regulations impact the NBFC sector? Okay, so the first thing is that they will balance the flexibility of the NBFCs and the risk that this flexibility can cause. Now, the primary benefit of an NBFC is that an NBFC is way more flexible than a bank. A bank cannot do a lot of things which NBFCs can do, but because the NBFCs are way more flexible than a bank, the potential to, I mean, not the risk of these NBFCs giving out let's say risky loans also keeps on increasing, and this flexibility itself can lead to a disaster, and the potential for systemic risk is very high. So if you have a four-layer structure like this, then you can regulate, at least try to regulate the bigger NBFCs and curtail some flexibilities that are given to them. Okay.
Now, another benefit could be improved trust and confidence in the NBFC sector. So one of the primary reasons with NBFCs, especially now after the ILNFS crisis and after the DHFL crisis, is that people are not very confident about the NBFC sector, right? So if people are not very confident about the NBFC sector, people will not give deposits to NBFCs, so NBFCs won't even have enough money to do a lot of their activities. Second is that people will not want to buy shares of these NBFCs, right? So the market capitalization of these NBFCs would reduce by a lot, by a lot, by a lot. So the NBFCs won't have money. So to counter all of this, if let's say the RBI comes in and has a stricter governance or stricter corporate governance norms for these NBFCs, तो लोगों को भरोसा हो जाएगा NBFC पे कि अब RBI आ गया है. So most likely the chances of NBFCs doing something shady will be reduced, and therefore more people will give their deposits to NBFCs, and more people will buy shares of NBFCs, thereby boosting their market capitalization and giving them more money to solve the problems that India has. Okay. Cool. I think the storm has stopped now. We'll probably be able to finish this. Okay. Furthermore, obviously, with the RBI coming in, RBI will obviously have stricter standards, and therefore overall transparency in the sector will increase, right? And therefore, this will reduce financial risks that are possible with these large NBFCs. Okay. Nepal political crisis, and naval protest in Russia. So Ashish, I'll probably try to fix it in one of the classes. Don't worry about that. So today, I don't think I'll be able to discuss it. I'll take a class later. I'll try to fix all of this. Okay. I'll fit in the Nepal political crisis and the naval protest in Russia. These are good topics. I'm anyways going to cover it. So abhi we've reached November, January, no? Abhi to bahut time hai, February, March, April. So these crises also happened then. So we're going month-wise, okay? Don't worry about it. Cool. Yeah, that's a good point, Khushpreet. So is my voice clear now, finally? Okay, so if you guys have any doubts, just put it in the everyone chat and not specifically to me, so that everyone can know that. Okay? So Khushpreet, Ashish was asking me to discuss your Nepal political crisis and the naval protest in Russia. And I told him, जब मार्का आएगा, अभी हम January में है, February, March, April है अभी बचा हुआ. So we'll discuss it once that happens. Okay. Cool. So now in the month of January, something very interesting happened. Our Prime Minister launched this summit called the Prarambh, or the Startup India International Summit. Now the entire point of the Prarambh Summit, Prarambh means to begin, right? So the entire point was to attract a lot of international attention to the startup ecosystem in India. Okay. And it's very likely that you will have certain questions on startup ecosystem, because startups have been very popular in India. And in spite of the pandemic, you've had like 13, 14 startups which have attained unicorn status. So unicorn status is basically once a startup has a valuation of $1 billion, that startup is known as a unicorn startup. So pandemic में जब दुनिया में economically बहुत issues आ रहे हैं, in 2020 also India has registered some 13, 14 unicorns. So therefore a lot has been written over what about these startups in particular and the startup ecosystem in general. I think the storm is cranking up again. So let's see if the storm doesn't disturb us. We'll probably try to finish it. Otherwise, we'll shift it to the next class. Anyways, now before we proceed, let's see what exactly is a startup. Okay. So startups in India, you should know, are governed by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And within the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, there is a very important department known as the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, DPIIT. So earlier on, this department was known as DIPP. It has been renamed to DPIIT. Okay, so you should know that startups are regulated by the DPIIT under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Okay. Now again, I will not go into the legal technicalities of this term. Okay. So it basically says that a startup is a company which is incorporated under it's a private limited company, or as defined in the Companies Act, or a partnership, or a limited liability partnership as described in the respective statutes. Okay. Now, on top of that,
the DPIIT has imposed certain conditions on your startups. Okay, so a company will be recognized as a startup only for a period of 10 years. अभी वो 10 साल से भी कुछ नहीं कर पा रही है, तो it won't be recognized as a startup, and it will stop getting the benefits that startups generally get. And 10 years is a fair enough period. Like you can't have a company and then say it's a startup for 15 years, right? It has to start up. The point of a startup is that start कर लिया, उसके बाद it's a full-fledged company, right? So if it's not starting up for 10 years, then probably it doesn't deserve to be a startup. Now, to get the benefits of being a startup, you have to have an annual turnover of less than 100 crore rupees in any financial year. So let's say the moment your turnover exceeds 100 crore rupees, then you don't really need protection and help from the government. You're a full-fledged functional company, and you probably and the benefits that startups get can then be given to other smaller startups. Okay. Now, also, like for a company to be registered as a startup, ऐसा नहीं है कि मैं और आप एक दुकान खोल लें और we open like a, I don't know, like a furniture shop and register it as a partnership, and then we try to go to the government of India and say a startup has to benefit. No. Like if you open a company, that company has to work towards certain innovative products, or it has to work in the development sector, or it has to improve existing products or processes or services. And this model has to be scalable, and it has to have a high potential for employment generation or wealth creation. So अपनी लिए नहीं, like you and I can't go and set up a partnership and then open a furniture shop बोल के कि इसको भी startup के benefit. So obviously not. Like there are certain innovations that you have to show in a startup. Any regular business cannot be a startup unless it's a highly innovative business, right? उसमें भी it has to be scalable. So if you're doing it as a small scale, आप 2 crore रुपए में काम कर रहे हो, you have to scale it to 200 crores, probably 2000 crore rupees, and then you have to generate employment or huge wealth. Okay. So only if you follow all of these things will you be classified as a startup, not otherwise. Otherwise, you just be a regular company or a partnership. Okay. Okay. So अब देखते हैं ये प्रारंभ समिट क्या है. So the Modi ji generally जब भी करते हैं तो largest ही होता है, biggest things are done by Modi ji. Okay. So Prarambh Summit is the largest Startup India International Summit that has been organized by the government of India since the Startup India initiative was launched in 2016. Okay. Now, the idea of Prarambh is to have a summit, basically meeting, gathering, a festival 2-3 दिन का, where you will have a lot of your top policy makers, people from the industry, people, academia, professors, etc., all sorts of investors, all sorts of small startups and stakeholders in this ecosystem across the globe. They will congregate in some place. Now, obviously, this will happen virtually only for now, but they will congregate in some place. There will be an exchange of ideas. People will see which sort of startups they like. People will come with a lot of money and try to invest in certain startups. The startups will want to attract a lot of that money. There would be professors, etc., which will then guide startups or give them some tips, etc. So it will be like a large fair of sorts, or वहाँ पे mutual interest में people will meet and then they will benefit out of that. Okay. Now, generally, the problem in startups is that startups don't have access to people like this. I mean, professors or academia and a lot of large investors go startup approach nahi kar pate. So if you have a summit like this, then the investors, both from India and abroad and academia, etc., are going to be present at the summit. So therefore, it gives startups a lot of exposure and it makes approaching these people way easier. Okay. Now, these people will discuss what are the good practices दुनिया भर में ecosystem startup का कैसे promote किया जा रहा है. Then this will obviously attract a lot of global capital. It will mobilize a lot of domestic capital. There are a lot of people in India who want to invest in startups, and startups don't know that these people want to invest in startups. So startups को पैसा नहीं मिल रहा है, पैसे वाले लोगों को startup नहीं मिल रहे हैं. So if these people meet at the Prarambh Summit, then both of the problems are solved. Okay. So second, it's like a meeting or a festival for all these people to get together and discuss about global startup ecosystem, funding, all of that, etc. Okay. Now, obviously, since startups are regulated by the Department for Promotion of Industry Internal Trade, DPIIT, this summit is also being organized by DPIIT, which functions under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry.
Now, this is very interesting because you have members from across 25 countries and you have 200 global speakers that have come here. So normal startup को India में ही लोग नहीं मिल रहे थे. Now you have members from 25 countries that have come here to participate in the summit. Okay, so the sort of exposure that these startups are going to get is going to be magnified by a large amplitude. Okay. Now, so let's see what is the size of the startup ecosystem in India and why are we organizing this summit in the first place. Okay, so if you look at it globally, India is the third largest startup ecosystem in the world, and as of the data that is available up till 2019, we have 38 unicorns jinka collective valuation is around $130 billion. So unicorns are basically companies or startup which have a valuation of $1 billion and above. So इससे छोटा छोटा startup, regular startup, once your startup crosses the valuation of $1 billion, then that startup is known as the this thing unicorn startup. Okay, now if you look at the rate of startups, India has seen a growth in the startup at an average rate of 15% year on year. So हर साल 15% बढ़ रहा है. It's not like 15% over a long period of time. So let's say there are 100 startups in the first year, then there are 115 startups in the next year, and then there are 15% of 115 startups. So effectively you have like 135, 36 startups. So year on rate बहुत तेज है, and this is a phenomenal number. Okay, and this growth is not limited to startups in like say 1 or 2 sectors, like not in food and beverage or in or let's say medical science or healthcare. These startups are emerging in all across the place, right? So you have startups in education, your Byju's, etc., right? And you have startups in health. You have pretty much everywhere. Startups are there everywhere, and these startups are utilizing technologies like blockchain, AI, Internet of Things, etc. Okay. So we'll also probably in one of these classes discuss what blockchain is, and we'll discuss what cryptocurrency is, and we'll discuss why government wants to ban the cryptocurrency. So this is something that's been in the news a lot recently, and I'm sure you guys are also excited about cryptocurrency. So kabhi in one of these classes, we'll also cover what exactly is cryptocurrency, what is the blockchain technology, etc. Okay. Anyways, now let's look at the sort of challenges that an average Indian startup faces. पहला मुद्दा पैसे नहीं है. Okay, so funding is a huge problem. Second is revenue generation. So even if startups get money, startups need a certain period of time. 5-6 साल लग जाते हैं to actually start earning money. So revenue generation is a problem, and because they are not able to generate revenue because of a lot of problems like your bureaucratic hurdles हैं, policy ही सरकार अच्छी नहीं बना रही है, infrastructure allocation नहीं है. So these are many problems that are all interlinked. So you don't have money, you can't generate revenue, then there is not enough adequate supporting infrastructure, logistically बहुत सारी problems है, offices नहीं है, all of that is a problem. Then bureaucratic hurdles हैं, like most of the people making policies are your 50-year plus 60-year-old people. समझ ही नहीं आ रहा उन्हें startup क्या है. Okay, and they don't even understand things like, let's say there is a startup which wants to invest in cryptocurrency, and the startup believes that blockchain technology can be something that will solve all of India's problems. Now it's going to pitch that idea to someone who's like a 60-year-old bureaucrat, and most likely this guy doesn't understand what blockchain is. So एक वो problem है. Okay, then you have like your regular corruption, etc. Compliance of laws is very hard. You have old laws that have to use to comply with. Now the cost of complying with these laws is very high. Okay, labor laws वगैरह हैं, उनसे comply करने में बहुत पैसा लग जाता है. So obviously these are issues that startups are facing, and obviously startups have a mentoring problem. They don't have people to guide them. So chalo Prarambh summit mein a lot of these problems can be solved, right? Obviously bureaucratic hurdles, infrastructure is outside the scope of the Prarambh summit, but at least you can raise funds there. People can find mentors, people can talk to people who have successfully had other startups. They can be guided by them in such summits. Okay, so let's see how Startup India, with an initiative which started in 2016, how does it help India? Okay, so it has rolled out several programs. Basically, it aims as a resolution of problems of startups by a 3-pronged strategy. Now, this 3-pronged strategy is taken from the official website of Startup India initiative itself. Okay, so the first strategy is hand holding. कि हम हाथ पकड़ के सिखाएंगे आपको, वी विल टेक यू थ्रू एंड गाइड यू थ्रू द प्रोसेस। हो सकता है कुछ इंजीनियर्स हों जिनको इंजीनियरिंग की फील्ड में बहुत आता है, एंड दे माइट वांट टू हैव अ स्टार्टअप देयर, बट उनकी बत्ती गुल है vis-a-vis लॉ, लाइक दे डोंट अंडरस्टैंड द लॉ एंड दे डोंट अंडरस्टैंड द सॉर्ट ऑफ compliances that they have to carry out. So the government says, don't worry, we will guide you through. So they'll give them legal support, okay, environment laws, labor laws, etc. The government says we'll help you with them. Then you have IPR. So these guys might develop certain technologies. They want that technology to be patent protected. They don't even know how to apply for patents. They don't have money to hire expensive lawyers. So then the government will come in and then say, okay, we will help you with the patent process, right? So this is a hand holding that will happen. Then they will also give them an exit process. So one of the reasons why a lot of foreign companies don't want to invest in India is because यहाँ company खोलना तो मुश्किल है, but company बंद करना उससे भी ज़्यादा मुश्किल है, right? So it's anyways hard to open a company, and if let's say your company goes bankrupt and you want to salvage some money, कुछ तो पैसा बचाना चाहते हो ना, zero नहीं करना चाहते, so you want to exit. So the exit mechanism is very hard. But recently with the insolvency and bankruptcy code which came out in 2016-17, things have become easier. So the government says that let's say we'll give you legal support, we will give you IPR, etc. Let's say your company goes bad, we will help you exit at a minimal loss. So इसीलिए hand holding बहुत सारी है. Then the government also says the second prong strategy is about funding and incentive. So the government says we will give you money, as not directly, they have funds, but we will also connect you with other venture capitalists and private enterprise that wants to invest. Okay. So first is the funds of fund. So SIDBI fund of fund is basically a fund that is that is started by the government of India. So initial corpus is 2,500 crores that is given by the government, and the idea is कि over a period of 4 years इसको 10,000 करोड़ तक ले जाया जाएगा. So this has happened. ये 2016 में बोला था, the initial corpus is 2,500 crores. Now it has crossed 10,000 crores. Okay, so this money will be used to give fundings to startups. Then you have credit guarantee. So let's say sometimes startups will have to take loan. So the government says, okay, it's okay, you take a loan. We will give a credit guarantee that in the eventuality that you are unable to pay that loan, we will help you with some of the loan. So उन्हें बैंक से सस्ते interest में loan मिल जाएगा. Then government also says that one of the major problems that startups have is that tax exemption, right? Because revenue ही बहुत कम है. So they want to save as much money as possible. So the government says, okay, don't worry, we'll give you an incentive in the form of tax exemption, right? So it says for 3 years, income tax exemption for capital gains tax to venture fund, etc., or any of the people who invest in startups. फिर the third prong strategy is your incubation strategy. So herein the government says we will give you support from industry, we will get academia to support you, then we'll hold multiple competitions, and the winners of those competitions will be given funding by the government, etc. We will create events like the Prarambh summit, for example, where you can meet people who will be able to support you through this startup journey, right? So these are the things that are being carried on by government of India under the Startup India scheme. Okay. So then this slide basically focuses on the sort of impact that this Startup India scheme has had. So 2016 say till 2020, India has recognized about 35,000 startups. Okay, and 1 million worth of benefits were given to a lot of startups. Now, like these are basic numbers. I don't think there'll be specific question vis-a-vis these numbers. But one thing that I want to discuss here is that Startup India has basically now said that it's created a global market and global access for knowledge for these Indian startups. And India now has bilateral agreements vis-a-vis startup with a lot of countries like your Russia, South Korea, etc. And so this whole structure is very important. This structure is known as a startup bridge. Okay, so collaboration between India and other countries to help the startup ecosystem in India is known as a startup bridge. So ये question आ सकता है आपको कि collaboration between Russia and China is a part of Dash. Now this is a startup bridge initiative. Okay. So otherwise, so for example, there is another thing is the government e-marketplace. So government has recently said that any procurement above, let's say 25-30,000, if it has to be carried by any department of the government, अब ये online होगा through the government e-marketplace, and you'll have to place proper orders to eliminate corruption, etc. Now, since this process is very transparent, a lot of startups have been listed in this process. तो अब जो वो पुराना system होता था यारी दोस्ती में सरकारी contacts से people used to make money, that is being taken care of, and now a lot of these small scale startups which are into manufacturing, they are being benefited because About 8,000 of them have been listed on the GM. So if there is a startup that is genuinely doing good work, if there's a startup that is genuinely making a cheap, good product, then obviously the government departments will compulsorily have to buy, because they will be outbidded, as in because the startups will be able to outbid everyone in the fair market, right? So these are certain steps that have been taken by Government of India over the year. And this is pretty much it that I had to discuss with you guys today. If you have any doubts, I'm going to be here for about like a minute. So आप पूछ सकते हैं. Otherwise, I think this is enough. But so there are certain topics obviously that we haven't discussed. वो अभी January चल रहा है as per my current affairs. So February, March, April, a lot of things, interesting things have happened. So we'll discuss these things as we move along. So if there is any doubt that anyone has, please let me know.
Sir,
Yeah.
am I audible?
Yeah, yes, you are.
Sir, will the PPTs be shared?
Yeah, so I have shared all the PPTs with Pratikesh. So you can ask Pratikesh for it. He'll WhatsApp or email it to you. Okay. Cool. Okay, that's it, I guess. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So,